Hi, this is Amir Anzoor. I'm Chief Marketing Officer of Pakistan Software Export Board, which promotes the brand Tech Destination Pakistan. We encourage companies to do business with Pakistan. Pakistan is open for business. We encourage you to bring your IT back office or even front office into the country, and you will love doing business with people like Bilal Mahmood. Bilal Mahmood is the managing director of Contour, which is a part of Constellation Software, which is the largest software company of Canada and is a top 10 software company in the world. Bilal moved out here over a decade ago, back from Canada. He's Pakistani born and raised, moved out to Canada for a few years and came back. And what we call a Wapistani, Wapis meaning someone who came back. So he's one of those that came back to the country, and he was a 13th employee and took it to over 1,700 employees, I believe now. And so someone that created a lot of jobs. And I would say he's a entrepreneur. So maybe not an entrepreneur that risked his own money and his savings, but someone that took a lot of risk growing a company internally. So became an entrepreneur, all the challenges that come with growing a company within a country like Pakistan or anywhere in the world, really. So he's multicultural, worked with a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and we'll hear his story, hear his story on leadership, how you go from less than a dozen people or a few dozen people to thousands of people, and that whole journey. So Bilal, just take us through your journey. How did you start and in the software business, and why did you decide to come back to Pakistan?
Thank you for having me on this call, Amir, and it's a real pleasure. A couple of things I'll quickly clarify. I was actually born in Canada. It's just a series of circumstances or serendipitous events that have me connected to two countries. I was born to diplomat parents who were posted in Ottawa serving Pakistan as diplomats when I was born there. And I was, a little over 2 years old when we came back to Pakistan. And so I went through all of my schooling in Pakistan, in Karachi, then Islamabad. And at university time, although I had the option of the US and Canada both, Canada worked out for me. And so I went back to Canada and I got my undergrad there. Then I worked, then I got my master's. And so, and then a few years of work. And after that, I came back to Pakistan. And so I've had this, back and forth between the two countries. So born and raised, more like born in Canada, raised in Pakistan, then higher level education in Canada. We're actually 2,300 employees almost, not 1,700 in Pakistan now, representing close to 3% of the global workforce of Constellation. But going back to the story, as I mentioned, I was born to diplomat parents in Canada. When the stint was over, it was time to come back to Pakistan. And outside of the US, if you're born in any other country, you're not a citizen by birth. So the diplomatic community means that you're only a citizen of whichever country your diplomat parents belong to. So I was a Pakistani, even though I was born there. Went through my schooling in Pakistan. And as I mentioned, at university time, I got to go to Canada. And I did essentially a software engineering degree with a second degree in business management. And what happened was that when I graduated, we were post 9/11 and post .com bust. So around the middle part of my undergrad, we were very, very sought after. And by the time It was graduation time, no one was hiring. So it was a bit of a struggle to enter the workforce. I was on a work visa and the clock was ticking. And I got a role at a home builder company. And they were essentially seeking to implement a home builder enterprise software system. And they felt that with my software engineering and my business management education, I could help with that. And that's how, I got into the industry. I was not in the industry I wanted to be in. And my role actually evolved very quickly from tech to sales and marketing. Through a stroke of luck, there was a temporary role. I did it really well, and it became a permanent role for me. And for 3.5 years or so, I was actually handling sales and marketing as well as IT for a company that was doing about $20 million of revenue a year. And towards the end of that, I went back to school, finished my MBA, and it was close to completion when I, got in touch with Constellation. And as luck would have it, the home builder software that my employer had been trying to implement was from Constellation Home Builder Systems. And so now I had home building industry, I had business experience, I had my MBA, and I was a software engineer. And so for Constellation Home Builder Systems, I had the trifecta. And Constellation Home Builder Systems was one division within Constellation Software. So this is how my journey at Constellation started back in Jan 2007.
And how did you end up being back in Pakistan? Is it something that you actively pushed for, or was it that Constellation Software said, you're Pakistani origin, why don't we open up an office in Pakistan? How did they become interested in opening up in Pakistan and eventually, hiring 2,300 people?
So I think it was a combination of serendipitous things that somehow, growing up, I had this sort of goal of, going abroad, studying, and then somehow coming back and doing something. But what exactly, wasn't really clear or obvious. And essentially what happened was this company, they had actually outsourced a project to a third-party outsourcer. And that work had been ongoing for a couple of years, and it was going well. And it turned out they had, instead of selecting a third-party outsourcer based in India, they had selected one based in Karachi. So there was some pre-existing comfort around, the cost and the quality and the communication that they were having with that third-party outsourcer. And on the basis of that, there was actually a company that was about to be acquired, which was going to be my first responsibility. And there was a good chance we were going to need to utilize a third-party outsourcer in order to get some major project work done at a lower cost base. And so my future boss had this, potential area of responsibility in his mind for me. And however, nothing really happened with it. I came on vacation to Pakistan. I met that third-party outsourcer, but then we never gave any additional work to them after that. But then almost 2 years after I joined the company, we came across a competitor that our company was looking to acquire in a particular industry domain. And it turned out they had an offshore staff office, about 50 people in Karachi, for R&D and support. And I got to travel to Karachi and do the due diligence on that operation as part of our evaluation of potentially acquiring that company. And so, although that deal didn't work out, when I came back to Canada, I had a very good perspective on if it's our own operation, what's the cost, what's the quality, what's the communication. And what was interesting was that where that first outsourcing experience we'd had, there had been a comparison between an Indian finalist and a Pakistani finalist, and over cost, they had selected the Pakistani operation. In the case of this offshore staff office. We had an Indian American and a Pakistani American as two founders, and they had selected Karachi because they had felt that from a quality perspective, for the number of people they needed, it was equivalent. From a cost perspective, there was a 30% differential in the favor of Pakistan. But the biggest advantage they felt was that it was going to be a lot easier to retain people long term, to build domain knowledge, and then be able to actually get the benefit of that long term by having people stay with the company long term. And so they had opted for Pakistan, Karachi. So this was our second instance of seeing that. And so when I came back to Canada from that trip, my particular operating group, we were faced with an industry-specific economic slowdown. And so we were more, or my leadership was more interested that we need to also build a capability like this. And that's where a journey started about a year and a half. I essentially engaged a few freelance contractors based out of Pakistan. We worked with 4 or 5 of our business units to prove the concept, do little pilot projects. And each one of them was successful and got us closer to building that comfort, as well as the decision process for potentially opening up a permanent operation. And we were getting pretty close to that when we had a third time lucky sort of situation where one of our sister operating groups acquired a UK-based company, which had 3 years prior made the same decision to open up an offshore staff office of only about a dozen or 13 people in Karachi. So that operation was in place. It was small. They needed a change in leadership. But that essentially gave us that starting off base. And we had a few divisions within my organization that were interested in hiring offshore staff for permanent needs. And that's essentially, 2010, that's when I moved from Canada to Pakistan and we began this adventure.
So you mentioned that you felt, or your management felt, that the staff you hired in Karachi would stay with you longer than other, if you went to a different country. Do you find that that's still the case? Or why is that the case? Is that something to do with culture or people looking for stability? Or was that, in those years that you came? Because IT is quite famous for people, sticking in a job for 2-3 years. I mean, you're someone who's stuck at it for 16, 17 years? In the
almost
same
18 now.
Yeah. 18, yeah. That's almost 2 decades. That's quite a feat. Would you say, what made you say that people stick at a job longer here?
So I think, back then, predominantly the comparison would be always with India, because India has been the big destination for captive centers and offshoring, outsourcing. And especially back then, but even, generally speaking, because you have all of Silicon Valley and the huge local demand on the Indian supply. So you definitely have a lot more, even with the much bigger pool, you do have a lot more competition and a lot more options. And so retaining talent is tougher. Historically, long term, that's what we have heard from a lot of people. And so we had that opportunity to essentially at least have a window where we could establish ourselves as a good employer and put in the right things in place and, build a sense of belonging so that people would ultimately spend enough time with us that they would, feel uncomfortable leaving. And essentially, Constellation, just because we're a product-based organization, we're not project-based. Each of our enterprise systems has been in the market for 20, 30, 40 years, serving long-term, essentially permanent needs. And so we especially we need people who, not just from a technical perspective or functional perspective, we need the customer relationships and especially those industry domain knowledge and expertise that gets built over time. Retaining that within the organization long term is of essential importance to us in terms of maintaining, supporting, and enhancing software systems for life. So for us, that's very important. We did start off hiring a certain profile of people that had probably done experimentation by then and were looking for a bit more stability. But I think then we, just put in place the sort of culture and environment, and we had enough of a window of time to be able to put in the time and effort to evolve our culture and our environment to such an extent that we would have people stay long term.
How do you do that? What's some tricks? Because tricks of the trade, would you say? Because that is the challenge in the IT industry. One of the biggest challenges is A, culture, developing a culture that people stay long term, and then B, being able to retain talent, because so many people have so many options in the technology world. Do you have a good pyramid that you've made and career progress so people can see? And then also, because you're such a large company, they can move within divisions. Maybe that's an advantage as well.
So definitely, when we go back in time, when we were, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 people, we had less budget, we had less options, we had less of everything to offer. But we had the scale, we had what Constellation calls human scale as an organization. And here I'm talking about the Pakistani part of it. And so it was a lot simpler to build relationships, invest in, systems and processes that would promote and foster a sense of objectivity in our compensation structure, in our performance management, etc. Those things were essential to reduce and minimize any sense of uncertainty, especially when you're talking about a high inflation location. You want to provide the sense of fairness and that opportunity is there equally. But alongside when you're small, it's easier to do some of the things in terms of spending the quality time with people to build relationships, which will then you invest in that, and that helps foster a bit of a core for your culture. And then as you scale, it becomes easier to scale the same culture as you evolve.
Okay, and what are some of the leadership lessons that you've had in almost 2 decades at this software company? What is your leadership style? How do you manage 2,300 people if they are under your remit? How do you only worry about the 6-7 people that report to you, or do you have to worry about 2,300 people and their jobs and their livelihood? Do you see it as stressful or a privilege to do that?
So it's a combination. Certainly, at the heart of it, you need to build people that you can trust, that they'll be making the similar sort of decisions that you would if you were in the room, because you can't be in every one of those rooms. So you want to build the same values, the same decision processes, the same culture, and that sense of what we're all about with your reports, so that they can then transfer the same to people that they're building. And you have to be a little bit more prescriptive early on, and then you can step back and let people replicate that. Definitely thinking long term is at the heart of Constellation's story of success. And we've tried to replicate what is a fairly unique organization, in that we're a service center or a staff center serving conglomerate of product divisions. And so we are product based overall, but our teams at Contour are essentially augmenting the divisions as well as corporate departments. So we're essentially a culture of cultures, and we get the benefit of what Mark Leonard, our founder, he calls human scale. So each business unit provides that human scale, even if we're starting to get too big to be able to have that kind of interaction with each and every person. But we do whatever we can to compensate for it. And of course, as you grow, you start to have a little bit more of budget to replace some of that human interaction. But as long as you keep descaling, sometimes one of the things Mark's letters to shareholders talk about is how in our business we don't actually believe in economies of scale, and at a certain point in time you have to descale again, because there's that limit to the number of quality relationships that each person can maintain.
And do you work with Mark in terms of how does Mark influence the culture overall? Is he still hands-on, or do you basically run it at Contour? Because you've got two separate brands, right? You've got Constellation, which is a master brand, and under that you have dozens of other brands. Do they basically run themselves?
So definitely. So Constellation has a very loosely federated model. And it's Constellation is very big on decentralization and being a culture of cultures, never wanting to have, because of the fact that essentially we're an agglomeration of about 1,500 plus acquisitions. Each of these companies has existed for 20, 30, 40 years independently at the time when they get acquired. And so certainly there are certain best practices and certain self-fulfillment focused formulae that are in place to get you towards the right outcomes. But how you get there, you have a lot of creative control. And so that's really at the heart of what Mark's built.
And how do you evaluate? Do you have evaluations for your employees, or is it targets on how much they sell? Or does each department have KPIs? How does that work?
So at the business unit level, there's certainly, fairly uniform bottom line and top line based business quality index, and every employee ends up essentially getting, their bonus compensation is tied to that business unit performance. And then if you're at a corporate level, then or if you're at a portfolio level, then it's a combination of the overall performance of those businesses. At the employee level, certainly we do have relative creative control and variation. Head office certainly has certain metrics that they prefer to receive at an aggregate level from each business unit. But then below that, you can certainly have some variation in which KPIs might make a little bit more sense in your particular scenario.
And what do you think is unique about working in the Pakistani culture? What's the pros and maybe a few cons even of working with Pakistan as a software company and the technology world? Why should people invest in Pakistan?
I think Pakistanis are very resilient people. We saw, especially during COVID, when a number of countries faced crises where they were, it was more of a shutdown scenario, and it was a much more resilient sort of response and a balance between safety as well as business as usual continuing. And we were able to actually grow Contour by about 200 people in the year 2020. So definitely I would say resilience is one of the facets. Definitely, if you look at any list, even today, you find Pakistan either the world's cheapest or amongst the 3 or 4 cheapest. So anyone spending in dollar terms, this is, I believe, the fourth or maybe the third largest population of English-speaking people, with at least their second language being English, and at the same time, from a cost perspective, despite all the high inflation, we remain amongst the cheapest from that perspective. And I think, lastly, I would say Pakistanis tend to be fairly creative. They have to be a bit more creative, and I think that helps certainly in software development, but even in other areas.
So currently, we as a software industry are growing at 24% a year. What would you say that Pakistan needs to do to grow even faster in the next couple of years?
I think policy consistency around taxation, around the infrastructure, in terms of, I would say those are the two big areas from a policy perspective: taxation and infrastructure. And the infrastructure that IT companies care about is the virtual one, not the physical one. So I would say those would be the two areas from a policy perspective. Other than that, I would also strongly urge government, especially, to buy locally. And in fact, as much as possible, the RFPs should be structured to avoid insourcing by government, and promote more local entrepreneurs, so that there are more systems that are developed locally by the commercial enterprises, so that they can be commercialized beyond their first use cases.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So those are good advice from someone who's been in the industry for a while. And okay. So what are the final words that you would say about someone thinking about investing in Pakistan or hiring talent from Pakistan? What words of advice would you give them to say, this is what I wish I knew before coming in and investing in Pakistan, and this is the opportunity that's untouched, or maybe the hidden opportunities?
So, I mean, because I'm paid to hire and retain people for my employer, and we tend to have a backlog all the time. So it's actually not in my interest for anybody else to come and tap into the same talent pool. But certainly, I think any company that's looking to hire quality resources at globally competitive pricing, one of the things we started to do, we could have done it earlier, was to also pay back into the system in terms of investing in talent development. So that's something we're doing a lot more of right now, in terms of boot camps and new grad programs, etc. I would say, collaborate with academia faster or earlier than we did. Certainly, our requirements were such that early on we were hiring mostly experienced people rather than people that could be built up. But certainly, we found newer graduates to certainly bring the kind of energy and not being anchored, of course, in older technologies or methodologies has certainly helped. And every year we find, the crop of graduates you come across people that are sometimes, um, their productivity sometimes is a lot more even than some of the senior colleagues. So the flow is good, but definitely that was an opportunity we didn't utilize as much until we were about 5 years into our existence. And then onwards, first couple of years, it was a little bit less utilized by us, and then we ramped up on that. That would definitely be something I would recommend others um, to tap into a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bilal Mahmood. If people want to check out Contour, where should they go?
So our parent company is csisoftware.com, and Contour is contour-software.com. And you can find us on LinkedIn. Probably we're most visible there. We do also have a YouTube channel where there's a lot of videos and content on our life at Contour.
Okay, thank you, Bilal. And as I said, it's amazing what you've done, taking from your first, I believe, acquisition of 13 people to 2,300 people. We need more people like you to create these jobs in the country and be the linkage with countries outside Pakistan, like you've done with Canada, and been one of those bridge makers. And people like you, when they come, they create thousands of jobs. That creates livelihoods for people. So that's great work. And we wish you success to getting to 23,000 and more beyond. It's going to be a recruitment challenge, but I'm sure you'll get there with all the people that we have available. So thank you for your time, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the podcast, and look forward to working with PSEB.
And this has been Bilal Mahmood of Contour Software with Amer Anzor, Chief Marketing Officer of Pakistan Software Export Board, Tech Destination Pakistan podcast.